The morning mist in Asheville held a fragile peace, broken only by the steady tap of Elara Thorne's wooden cane. Beside her, Atlas, her silent guardian, sensed the predator before the gold-plated golf club could strike. A wealthy man believed his name made him a god, entitled to crush anything in his path. But he failed to see the ghost in the shadows, a former Marine Recon with a lethal code of honor, watching from the darkness. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. If this story of courage touches your soul, please subscribe for more. The mist in Asheville doesn't just settle, it breathes. It is a living, shifting veil of silver and charcoal that clings to the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge, weaving through the ancient hemlocks like the ghosts of a forgotten era. It was early, the kind of hour where the world feels suspended between a dream and reality, and the Blue Ridge Community Garden was steeped in a heavy, sacred silence. Here, the air tasted of damp earth, wild mint, and the sharp medicinal tang of pine needles. Elara Thorne moved through the terraced rows with a rhythmic, measured cadence. The steady thump-tap of her prosthetic limb against the stone path was the only heartbeat the garden knew at this hour. She was a woman who understood the language of things that grew in the dark. A daha thuk vat hok by trade and a healer by soul, Elara had spent the last 3 years turning this rocky slope into a sanctuary of rare, wild blooms. Her accident, a devastating collision on a rain-slicked mountain road, had claimed her left leg and the life she once knew, but it had gifted her a different kind of vision. She didn't just see plants, she saw their resilience. She saw how a wildflower could split a stone just to find the light. Clinging to her shadow was Atlas. He was a magnificent blend of golden retriever gentleness and Malinois intensity, his coat the color of toasted wheat against the morning gray. Atlas was more than a dog. He was her anchor. Born with a deafness in his left ear, he navigated the world through vibration and intuition. He didn't need to hear the world to protect Elara. He felt the erratic skip of her heart before she even knew she was anxious. He was a silent guardian, his head perpetually scanning the perimeter, his senses tethered to the woman who had rescued him from a high-kill shelter just as she was learning to walk again. To anyone else, they were a broken pair. To each other, they were a complete fortress. Elara paused near a bed of rare Oconee bells, their delicate white fringes shivering in the breeze. She knelt, her hands, stained with the dark, rich soil of the mountains, tenderly brushing away a stray weed. "Almost time to bloom, isn't it, boy?" she whispered. Atlas didn't hear the words, but he felt the warmth of her breath and thumped his tail twice against the damp mulch, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared world. But they weren't entirely alone in this mountain silence. Tucked into the edge of the property, where the garden met the forest's edge, sat a weathered garage that smelled of motor oil and aged cedar. In its shadows sat Caleb Vance. He was a man built of iron and secrets, his frame broad and rigid, etched with the scars of a life lived in the world's most violent corners. Caleb was a former Marine Recon Treen Sat, a man who had spent a decade operating in the black, those spaces where the sun rarely reaches and the rules of civilization don't apply. He was on a terminal leave he hadn't asked for, sent home to decompress from a mission that still played behind his eyelids in high-definition horror. Caleb didn't speak much. He didn't have to. Instead, his hands were always moving. He sat on a low stool, a block of cherry wood in one hand and a razor-sharp carving knife in the other. He didn't carve toys or trinkets. He carved intricate anatomical studies of birds in flight, wings stretched to their limit, muscles tensed for escape. It was his ritual of maintenance, a way to channel the lethal precision of his training into something that didn't involve a trigger. He watched Elara and Atlas from the darkness of his shop, his gray eyes, flat and focused, calculating the safety of the perimeter by instinct. He was a specter of the past, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen the company of wood and mountain mist instead. The piece of the morning was a fragile thing, a glass ornament held in the palm of a trembling hand. It was shattered not by a scream, but by the invasive, guttural snarl of a high-performance engine. The sound was a physical assault, a jagged blade of noise that sliced through the mountain air. A metallic gold SUV, far too wide and aggressive for the narrow mountain roads, lurched into the gravel pull-off at the garden's entrance, its tires spitting stone like shrapnel. The stereo was thumping a rhythmic, mindless beat that vibrated in Caleb's chest, a frequency he associated with approaching threats. From the driver's seat emerged Sterling. He was a man who wore his father's congressional power like a tailored suit, expensive, stifling, and unearned. His blond hair was perfectly coiffed despite the humidity, and he moved with the easy, toxic arrogance of someone who viewed the world as an asset to be liquidated. Sterling didn't look at the mountains. He looked at the acreage. He didn't see the Oconee bells or the years of Elara's labor. He saw a footprint for a luxury hotel, a monument to his own greed. He stepped onto the stone path, his polished leather shoes a stain against the natural earth, holding a gold-plated golf club like a scepter. Beside him, his two enforcers trailed like obedient wolves, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses. The sanctuary was no longer a place of healing. The serpent had entered the garden, and the silence was about to be replaced by the cold, calculated sound of a coming storm. Caleb's knife slowed, his eyes locked on Sterling's back. The Marine was no longer carving. He was acquiring a target. The heavy, metallic thud of a car door closing echoed through the valley like a gavel striking a bench. Sterling did not walk into the garden. He occupied it. He moved with a calculated, predatory elegance, his polished leather loafers clicking sharply against the stone path Elara had laid by hand. He looked entirely out of place against the raw, honest beauty of the Blue Ridge, a splash of artificial gold against a canvas of deep forest green. In his right hand, he carried a gold-plated 7-iron, swinging it casually as if the world were nothing more than his private fairway. He stopped 10 feet from Elara, the smell of his expensive, cloying cologne cutting through the scent of rain-washed pine. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at her leg, his gaze lingering on the carbon fiber and steel of her prosthetic with a flicker of distaste. "Miss Thorne," he began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone designed for campaign trails and boardrooms. "I believe you received my father's letter. This little project of yours is over. The permits have been revoked. This hillside is destined for something much more productive than wild weeds." Elara didn't flinch. She leaned into her oak cane, her fingers tightening around the wood until her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Atlas sat perfectly still, a low, tectonic rumble beginning to vibrate deep in his chest. "These aren't weeds, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady and clear as mountain water. "This is a sanctuary, and no amount of your father's influence can buy the history rooted in this soil. The answer remains the same. The garden stays." A silence fell over the terrace, heavy and suffocating. Sterling's smile didn't fade, but it curdled. To anyone else it was a simple refusal, but in the twisted architecture of Sterling's mind, it was a declaration of war. You see, in the study of human behavior, what Sterling was experiencing is known as a narcissistic injury. For men like him, the world is not a place of shared existence. It is a mirror designed to reflect their own grandiosity back at them. Sterling viewed himself as a giant, a man of such immense gravity that the world was supposed to bend toward him. When Elara Thorne, a woman he deemed broken, a woman who lived in the dirt, looked him in the eye and said no, that mirror didn't just crack, it shattered. His aggression was not born of strength, but of a terrifyingly fragile ego. He could only feel powerful by ensuring everyone around him felt small. Every time he swung that gold-plated club, he wasn't practicing a sport, he was wielding a scepter of entitlement. To him, Elara wasn't a person. She was a Chong Yingai vat, a glitch in the system of his own perfection that needed to be erased. Contrast this with the man watching from the shadows of the garage. Caleb Vance possessed what psychologists call a quiet ego. His strength didn't need a golden club or a senator's name to sustain itself. His power was rooted in a lethal, disciplined competence that required no audience. Caleb understood that true strength is a tool for protection, not a garment for vanity. But Sterling was a hollow giant, a man who lived in constant, agonizing fear of being seen as ordinary. And nothing makes a man like that more dangerous than being reminded of his own insignificance. Sterling's eyes narrowed, the passionate mask slipping to reveal a cold, festering malice. A woman in your condition should be more careful about who she crosses, he hissed, stepping closer, invading the sacred space between Elara and her flowers. You think this chair and those seeds make you special? You're a footnote, Elara, and I'm the one who writes the history of this town. He raised the gold club, not to strike, but to point it at Atlas's chest, the metal gleaming wickedly in the filtered light. Atlas didn't bark, he didn't snap. He simply stood up, moving his body with a fluid, silent grace to block Elara completely. The dog's eyes, amber and unblinking, locked onto Sterling's. It was a standoff between a predator who bought his power and a guardian who was born with it. Sterling recoiled slightly, the sudden quiet intensity of the animal prickling his skin. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine, unadulterated fear. And because he was a man who couldn't handle his own weakness, that fear turned instantly into a blinding, white-hot rage. He felt humiliated by the woman, humiliated by the dog, and most of all, humiliated by the fact that for the first time in his life, he was being looked down upon by those he considered less than. You have 24 hours, Sterling spat, his face flushed a dark, angry purple. Enjoy your garden while you can, Miss Thorne, because by this time tomorrow I'm going to make sure there's nothing left of it but dust. And that mutt, he'll be lucky if I leave him with a place to sleep. He turned on his heel, his leather shoes scuffing the dirt he so clearly loathed. The SUV roared back to life, its tires screaming as it tore away, leaving a cloud of toxic exhaust to settle over the Oconee bells. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer a peace, it was a countdown. Caleb Vance watched the dust settle from the darkness of his shop, his fingers tracing the edge of his carving knife. The snake had left its venom in the garden, and Caleb knew that a snake never strikes just once. He looked at Elara, who was still standing, her head high despite the trembling in her hands, and he made a silent vow. The giant might be empty, but he was about to learn that some gardens are protected by more than just fences. The mountain air in the Blue Ridge Community Garden didn't just turn cold, it became electric, a precursor to a storm that had no name. Sterling stood in the center of the terrace, his polished loafers digging into the soil, his gold-plated 7-iron trembling in a hand fueled by a volatile mix of entitlement and adrenaline. The mask of the senator's son, the polished veneer of the real estate mogul, had completely evaporated. In its place was a feral, cornered child who had never been told no, and his ego was hemorrhaging. Sterling didn't think. He reacted with a frantic, uncoordinated violence. He wrung his club in a wide, whistling arc, the metal cutting through the natural shadow of the pines with a flash of artificial gold. Atlas, sensing the trajectory before the swing was even complete, lunged forward, not to bite but to serve as a living shield for Elara. The sound of the metal connecting with the dog's ribs was sickening. It was a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the very roots of the ancient oaks surrounding them. Atlas let out a strangled, high-pitched yelp, a sound of pure shock that sliced through the quiet. His powerful legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the damp mulch, gasping for air as the wind was knocked out of his lungs. No! Elara's scream was raw, a sound of unadulterated anguish that echoed uselessly against the ridges. She lunged toward her dog, forgetting the limitations of her own body in a desperate bid to reach him. Her prosthetic skidded on the rain-slicked stones of the path, and she crashed to the earth. Her oak cane, the one constant in her world of shifting balances, skittered across the stones and came to rest far out of reach among the ferns. She was grounded, vulnerable, her hands clawing at the dirt as she tried to drag herself to Atlas. Sterling loomed over her, his breathing ragged, his face flushed a dark, angry purple. He looked down at the woman he deemed broken, a cruel, triumphant smile beginning to twitch at the corners of his mouth. "I told you, Elara," he hissed, the smell of expensive whiskey and panic on his breath. "I told you what happens when you stand in my way." He raised the gold club again, his eyes fixed on the whimpering dog. But he never made the second swing. Caleb Vance didn't shout a warning. In the world of Marine Recon, a warning was a luxury that got good men killed. He emerged from the shadow of the garage like a part of the mist itself, moving with a silent, ground-eating stride that was as economical as it was lethal. He didn't look like a man running. He looked like a force of nature reclaiming its territory. The first enforcer, a man built like a granite block, turned just in time to see a blur of charcoal gray. Caleb didn't waste time with a punch. He executed a precise brachial stun to the side of the man's neck, a strike so fast it was almost invisible. The concussive shockwave sent the enforcer's nervous system into an immediate shutdown. His eyes rolled back and his body turned into dead weight before his knees even hit the grass. The second man, sensing the sudden shift in the air, reached for a holster concealed beneath his tailored jacket. He was too slow. Caleb was already inside his guard, his movements a clinical study in joint manipulation. Caleb seized the man's wrist, a sharp, practiced twist sending a sickening pop through the mountain air as the radius and ulna were forced past their limits. With a fluid, unbroken transition, Caleb delivered a palm heel strike directly to the man's solar plexus. The impact was hollow, a heavy thud that vacuumed the air from the man's lungs. He folded like a house of cards, clutching his chest in a desperate, silent struggle for oxygen. Now there was only Sterling. The gold-plated club was raised in a pathetic, trembling defense. Sterling swung, a wild, amateurish arc born of pure, unadulterated terror. Caleb didn't even flinch. He stepped into the arc, parrying the gold shaft with his left forearm while his right hand clamped onto Sterling's throat. The momentum of the swing was neutralized in a split second, and Sterling found himself hoisted nearly off his feet. The garden fell into a ringing, absolute silence. The only sounds were the distant, indifferent call of a hawk and the frantic, wheezing gasps coming from Sterling's throat. Caleb held him there, his grip like a steel vise, forcing the senator's son to look him in the eye. Caleb's eyes were the most terrifying part of the encounter. They weren't filled with rage. They were flat gray, devoid of heat, devoid of mercy, and utterly empty of the recognition Sterling so desperately craved. It was the gaze of a man who had seen the abyss and had brought a piece of it back to the surface with him. Caleb didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply applied a fraction more pressure, a silent reminder of how fragile Sterling's world truly was. Then, with a contemptuous shove, Caleb released him. Sterling collapsed into the dirt, clutching his throat, his gold-plated club discarded like a piece of trash in the mud. The Marine stood over him, not as a hero, but as an apex predator watching a wounded scavenger. He turned his head slowly toward Elara, who was still trembling on the ground, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. She looked at the man who had appeared from the shadows, the man who had dismantled 3 threats in less time than it took for a heart to beat. Caleb didn't offer a hand yet. He stood there, a silent sentinel in the forest, as the mist began to swallow the garden once more, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and the cold, hard reality of justice. The fluorescent lights in the Buncombe County precinct didn't illuminate. They exposed. They flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing irritability that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Elara's bones. The air inside was a stagnant cocktail of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the cold, metallic scent of bureaucratic indifference. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the scent of pine and rain that Elara carried on her skin. Here, justice didn't feel like a living thing. It felt like a machine that had long ago run out of oil. Elara sat in a rigid plastic chair, her prosthetic leg feeling like a heavy, foreign anchor. Beside her, Atlas lay perfectly still, his chin resting on his paws. He was quiet, but his amber eyes were fixed on the glass partition, his ears tracking every slammed drawer and every muffled conversation. Every time Elara's hand trembled, Atlas would nudge her knee, a silent, physical reminder that she was not alone. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward an hour of waiting, that feeling of isolation began to seep in like the mountain chill. "Miss Thorne, Deputy Rollins will see you now." The voice was disembodied, coming from a clerk who didn't bother to look up from her monitor. Elara stood, her oak cane clicking against the linoleum with a sound that felt dangerously small in this hollow space. She walked down a narrow hallway to an office that smelled of old tobacco and unwashed pride. Deputy Rollins was a man who looked like he had been molded from the very chair he sat in. He was thick-waisted, with skin the color of parched parchment, and eyes that possessed the flat, glazed quality of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't even look at the bruise beginning to bloom like a dark orchid across her cheek. He simply tapped a pen against a stack of files, the sound a tiny, aggressive drumbeat. "I'm here to report an assault," Elara began, her voice brittle but clear. Sterling came to the community garden. He attacked my service animal. He threatened my life. I have a witness." Rollins finally looked up, but there was no sympathy in his gaze. Instead, there was a weary, patronizing smirk. "A witness? You mean that man Vance? The one who nearly put 3 of Mr. Sterling's associates in the hospital?" Rollins leaned back, his chair groaning under the weight of his apathy. "Honey, let's be realistic. You're talking about the son of a United States Senator, a man who has donated more to this county's infrastructure than most people earn in a lifetime. He kicked a dog, Deputy. He pushed a disabled woman to the ground," Elara hissed, the anger finally breaking through the ice of her shock. Rollins sighed, a long, theatrical sound of exasperation. "What I see here, Miss Thorne, is a misunderstanding. Mr. Sterling says your dog lunged at him. He says he was defending himself. And as for you, well, accidents happen on Slick Mountain. Stones. You're lucky he isn't pressing charges for the injuries your witness inflicted on his security team." He slid a manila folder across the desk. It wasn't a police report. It was a legal ultimatum. "And while you're here, I was asked to serve you this." Elara's breath hitched. She opened the folder. The words blurred before her eyes, but the headings were clear. Emergency injunction. Revocation of land use permit. Order of eviction. "Environmental hazards," Rollins said, his voice devoid of heat. "Soil contamination from unauthorized botanical experiments. You have 48 hours to vacate the Blue Ridge Garden. If you're still there by Friday, I'll be coming up the mountain myself to remove you. And I won't be as polite as Mr. Sterling was." The room seemed to tilt. The walls, the flickering lights, the indifferent man behind the desk, it all felt like a crushing weight. Elara realized then that Sterling wasn't just fighting for land. He was erasing her. He was using the very system meant to protect her to tear out the roots of the life she had fought so hard to rebuild. Justice wasn't blind in Buncombe County. It was simply for sale. "You can't do this," she whispered, her fingers clutching the edge of the desk. "I just did," Rollins replied, turning back to his computer. "Have a nice day, Miss Thorne, and watch your step on the way out." Elara walked out of the precinct into a world that had turned gray. A cold, relentless mountain rain had begun to fall, turning the Asheville streets into a blur of asphalt and neon. She stood under the small concrete overhang of the building, the eviction notice clutched in her hand, feeling the absolute, crushing weight of despair. Everything she had worked for, the sanctuary that had brought her back from the brink of death, was being stolen by a man with a gold-plated club and a borrowed name. She felt small. She felt invisible. She felt like a footnote in someone else's story. She didn't see Caleb at first. He was standing 20 yards away, leaning against his mud-splattered truck, his charcoal-gray hoodie pulled low. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't seem to notice the rain that was soaking through his clothes. He was just there, a silent sentinel in the storm. Elara stepped out into the downpour, her cane slipping once, twice, before Atlas leaned his weight against her leg to steady her. She reached the truck, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes red with unshed tears. She held up the folder, the paper already wilting in the rain. "They're taking it, Caleb," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "They're taking the garden. They're taking everything." Caleb didn't look at the folder. He didn't offer a platitude or a hollow promise. He reached out, his large, calloused hand steadying her arm with a grip that was as firm as a mountain root. He looked at the bruised orchid on her cheek, then up at the precinct doors. His gray eyes were no longer flat. They were burning with a cold, calculated fire. A fire that had survived a dozen wars and was now focused on one single purpose. "Get in the truck," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it held a terrifying certainty that cut through her despair. "They think they've won because they own the building and the badges, but they don't own the mountain, and they sure as hell don't own me." He closed the door for her, a simple act of protection that felt more powerful than any legal document. As they pulled away, Elara looked back at the glowing lights of the precinct. She felt the cold rain on the window, but inside the cab, the air was warm and smelled of cedar and wood smoke. She realized then that when the world in go and mat, when the system you trusted crumbles into dust, you don't need a lawyer or a politician. You need a ghost. You need a man who has lived in the dark and knows exactly how to hunt the monsters who hide there. The storm was just beginning, but for the first time since the accident, Elara Thorne wasn't afraid of the thunder. She was waiting for the lightning. The night in the Blue Ridge Mountains usually belongs to the shadows and the rhythmic pulse of the cicadas, but tonight the silence was hollow. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the mountain air is at its crispest. Yet a new, predatory scent began to crawl through the rhododendrons. It wasn't the smell of damp earth or pine, it was the acrid, chemical sting of industrial herbicide. Sterling didn't come with a golf club this time. He came with a sprayer and a heart full of festering, unadulterated malice. He moved through the terraced rows of Elara's garden like a plague, the steady, rhythmic hiss of the nozzle the only sound in the dark. He wasn't just killing plants, he was suffocating a woman's soul. He watched as a toxic liquid soaked into the soil, coating the delicate, shivering fringes of the Oconee bells, flowers that had survived ice and storm only to be ended by a man's bruised ego. He didn't stop until every ma'am Zan, every labor of love Elara had nurtured for 3 years, was glistening with a deadly, oily sheen. Before he left, Sterling reached into his bag for a final, theatrical flourish. The rattle of a spray paint can echoed sharply off the rock face. In large, dripping, angry letters, he scrawled a message across the ancient limestone wall that served as the garden's backdrop. The red paint looked like a fresh wound against the gray stone. Next time, the dog dies. When the first light of dawn began to bleed over the peaks, the garden didn't wake up. It was a graveyard. Elara Thorne stepped onto the porch, her nose instantly catching the toxic, metallic stench that had replaced the morning dew. Her heart didn't just sink, it stalled. She moved as fast as her prosthetic would allow, the thump-tap of her cane sounding frantic against the stone path. She reached the terrace and collapsed to her knees. The sight was a hurricane of destruction. The vibrant greens and soft whites were gone, replaced by a sickening, blackened sludge. The stems were limp, the leaves curling into themselves as the chemicals burned through their cellular walls. Her sanctuary, the place that had taught her how to walk, how to breathe, and how to hope again, was a scorched earth zone. She reached out a trembling hand to touch a blackened rhododendron, but pulled back as if the plant itself were screaming. And then she saw the wall. The red letters seemed to vibrate in the morning light. Next time, the dog dies. Elara didn't scream. She didn't have the air for it. She simply sat in the dirt, the toxic smell clinging to her clothes, a silent, broken statue in the middle of her own desecrated grave. The system had failed her. The law had ingoen mat. And now her only companion was being used as a bargaining chip for her silence. Caleb Vance found her there 10 minutes later. He didn't come from his truck. He emerged from the tree line, his movements silent, his eyes scanning the perimeter with a cold, tactical snapshot. He didn't need to ask what happened. He saw the wilted rose. He smelled the poison, and his gaze locked onto the red paint on the limestone, his fists slowly uncurled, his fingers stretching as the familiar, dull ache of adrenaline began to hum through his veins. For weeks, Caleb had lived in the white, the defensive, watchful state of a man trying to forget the war. But as he looked at Elara's bowed head and the dripping thread on the wall, the white faded into a flat, focused gray. This was no longer a civilian dispute. This was a tactical escalation. Sterling had made the classic mistake of a bully. He assumed that because Caleb was quiet, he was harmless. He assumed that the rules of Asheville's high society applied to a man who had spent a decade operating in the shadows of the world's most dangerous borders. Caleb knelt beside Elara, his large, calloused hand resting on her shoulder, not with a gesture of comfort, but with the firm, grounding pressure of a commander steadying a soldier. "Don't touch the soil," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that was more chilling than any shout. "The toxicity is high." Elara looked up, her eyes empty, the fire behind them extinguished by the weight of the devastation. "He won, Caleb," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp of air. "He took it all. He's going to kill Atlas. We have to go. We have to leave before he comes back." Caleb didn't look at her. He was looking at the mountain, calculating the terrain, the entry points, and the predictable arrogance of a man who thought he was the apex predator. "No," Caleb stated. "It wasn't an argument. It was a fact. We aren't leaving. Sterling thinks he knows how this ends because he's played this game with lawyers and badges. But he doesn't know the rules of the field. He brought a tantrum to a gunfight." Caleb stood up, his posture shifting. The ghost who had been carving birds in the garage was gone. Standing in the center of the ruins was a Marine Recon Treen sat, a man who understood that, in the dark, money doesn't make noise and influence doesn't stop a heart from racing. "Elara, listen to me," he said, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying certainty. "They think you're broken. They think this garden was your only strength. We're going to let them keep thinking that. From this moment on, we stop playing defense. I'm going to teach them exactly what happens when you corner a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect." He turned back toward his garage, his stride economical and swift. The time for carving wood was over. It was time to set a perimeter. It was time to turn the garden into a kill zone of a different kind. Sterling wanted a war, and Caleb Vance was about to give him one he would never survive. The serpent had left its poison, but the mountain was about to strike back. The night on the Blue Ridge wasn't just dark, it was a void, a silent vacuum waiting to be filled with the consequences of a man's arrogance. It was midnight, and the community garden, once a sanctuary of life, now smelled of chemical rot and cold limestone. The vibrant green terraces were blackened scars under the moonless sky, but in the shadows of the old garage, the ghost was no longer carving wood. Caleb Vance was setting a perimeter. He didn't use claymores or tripwires. Those were for a different kind of war. Tonight he was using data. He moved with a clinical, silent efficiency, mounting small black, puck-shaped sensors onto the trunks of the charred rhododendrons. He checked the tablet mounted to his forearm, the screen casting a faint, ghostly green glow over his features. The thermal overlay mapped every heat signature within 100 yards, the scurrying of a field mouse, the slow cooling of the stone path, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the two souls waiting in the center of the terrace. Atlas sat perfectly still next to Elara, who was tucked into the deepest shadow of the limestone wall. To the casual observer, they were a woman and her dog. To Caleb, they were the most sophisticated sensor array on the mountain. You see, we call Atlas a service dog, but science describes his bond with Elara as something far more profound: biosignal synchronization. In the world of human behavior, they are a single, unified organism. Studies show that the heart rates and cortisol levels of a service animal and their owner don't just mimic each other, they synchronize, vibrating on the same emotional frequency. As Elara sat in the dark, her hand resting on Atlas's neck, their pulses beat as one. When her breath hitched in fear, Atlas's pupils dilated. When his ears twitched toward a distant sound, a jolt of adrenaline bypassed Elara's conscious mind and went straight to her nerves. This bond was the reason Sterling's violence had been so devastating. He hadn't just kicked a dog, he had assaulted Elara's very sense of existence. But tonight, that same bond was their greatest weapon. Atlas wasn't just waiting, he was a high-gain antenna, filtering the mountain air for the specific frequency of a monster. He was the bait, yes, but he was also the trigger. The silence was broken by the familiar, intrusive roar of the gold SUV. It groaned up the steep incline, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a blind predator. Sterling didn't turn off the engine this time. He wanted the noise. He wanted the intimidation. He stepped out of the vehicle, the gold-plated club over his shoulder, flanked by his two remaining associates. He moved with a manic, whiskey-fueled confidence, his boots crunching over the blackened remains of the Oconee bells. "Elara!" he shouted, his voice echoing mockingly off the ridges. "I told you I'd be back for the mutt. You had 48 hours, but I decided I didn't want to. Wait, let's finish this." He walked into the garden like a man stepping onto a stage, unaware that the stage was a kill zone designed by a Marine Recon specialist. Sterling saw Atlas sitting in the middle of the terrace, illuminated by the SUV's headlights. The dog looked vulnerable, a solitary figure against the dark forest. Sterling laughed, a jagged, ugly sound that made the air feel thin. "There you are," Sterling hissed, tightening his grip on the golf club. "You think that SEAL friend of yours is going to save you again? He's a ghost, Elara, and ghosts don't stop gold." He stepped past the first charred terrace, crossing an invisible line Caleb had marked on his screen. Target acquired. Sterling didn't see the tiny, high-definition cameras hidden in the stone. He didn't notice the directional microphones capturing every slur, every threat, and every confession of his intent. He was so consumed by his own narcissistic injury, so desperate to reclaim his feeling of power, that he failed to notice the absolute silence of the man he was hunting. Caleb Vance sat 20 yards away, a high-sensitivity tablet in his lap and a directional mic in his hand. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was gathering intel. He watched the thermal silhouettes on his screen, 3 hostiles, 1 primary moving toward the bait. Caleb's breathing remained slow, a habitual rhythm that lowered his own heat signature. He watched as Sterling raised the gold club, the metal gleaming in the artificial light. Elara's heart rate spiked, a sharp, jagged line on Caleb's monitor. Instantly, Atlas's body tensed, his weight shifting, his amber eyes fixed on Sterling's throat. The biosignal bond was at its peak. Elara wasn't just watching. She was feeling every predatory inch of Sterling's approach. "Say goodbye, Ms. Thorne," Sterling roared, swinging the club back for a finishing blow. Click. The SUV's headlights didn't just flicker, they died. Caleb had used a remote frequency jammer to kill the vehicle's electrical system, plunging the garden into a total, suffocating blackness. Sterling's triumphant shout died in his throat, replaced by a frantic, wheezing gasp. He was blind. He was alone. and for the first time in his life, his money and his name couldn't buy him a single candle. "Chad! Rollins!" Sterling screamed into the dark, his voice cracking with a sudden infantile terror. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind through the pines and the soft, rhythmic thump-tap of a wooden cane moving somewhere in the shadows. The hunter had become the prey, and the garden, once a place of healing, had become a labyrinth of his own making. Caleb Vance watched through his night vision goggles, a shadow among shadows, as the serpent began to realize that on this mountain, the only law that mattered was the one he had just broken. The trap was sprung, and the Blue Ridge was about to demand its payment in full. The darkness in the Blue Ridge garden wasn't just a lack of light. It was a clinical, tactical vacuum. Sterling was screaming into the void, his voice cracking with an infantile terror that his money couldn't silence. He swung the gold-plated club at ghosts, the metal whistling uselessly through the humid air. He didn't know that every desperate slur, every threat to kill the mutt, and every swing of his scepter was being captured by the very thing his family feared most, the truth. Click. Suddenly, the garden was flooded not with sunlight, but with the cold, unforgiving blue light of a dozen high-output LED arrays Caleb had rigged to the limestone wall. Sterling winced, shielding his eyes, completely blinded by the sudden brilliance. But the light wasn't the real trap. The real trap was the small, glowing screen of a smartphone Caleb held up, its lens focused squarely on Sterling's distorted, hate-filled face. "You're late for the rally, Sterling," Caleb said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that cut through Sterling's panic. "But don't worry. Your father's supporters are already watching." Caleb had bypassed the garden's isolation by slaving the hidden camera feeds to a portable satellite uplink. He hadn't just recorded the crime, he had live-streamed it directly onto the official congressional campaign page of Senator Sterling. At that very moment, 50,000 voters were watching the senator's son stand in a desecrated sanctuary, clutching a weapon and threatening a disabled woman. The narcissistic injury was no longer a private shame. It was a national catastrophe. Sterling's face turned a sickening shade of gray. "Turn it off," he shrieked, lunging forward with the gold club. "I'll kill you. I'll bury both of you." Caleb didn't move until the very last second. He didn't need a weapon. He used Sterling's own manic momentum against him. As the club descended, Caleb stepped into the red zone, his left hand parrying the gold shaft while his right hand executed a precise palm strike to Sterling's chest. The impact was a heavy, sickening thud. Sterling's air was vacuumed from his lungs and he collapsed into the blackened remains of the Oconee bells, gasping like a fish out of water. Then Caleb did something that Elara didn't expect. He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a small, serrated combat blade, and with a steady, surgical hand, drew a shallow but bleeding line across his own forearm. He let the blood drip onto the stone path right next to the discarded golf club. In the eyes of the law, a Marine Recon specialist subduing a civilian was a liability. But a wounded man defending a sanctuary against an armed intruder, that was a closed case. The sirens didn't take long. The mountain air was soon filled with the rhythmic, pulsing blue and red of emergency lights. Deputy Rollins was the first one through the gate, his hand on his holster, his face set in the usual mask of bored authority. He expected to find Elara Thorne in tears and Caleb Vance in handcuffs. Instead, he found a massacre of public relations. Rollins looked at Sterling, who was sobbing in the dirt. He looked at the red paint on the wall, and then he looked at the tablet Caleb was holding, the screen still scrolling with thousands of comments from outraged citizens, many of them demanding to know why the police hadn't arrived sooner. Rollins visibly stiffened. The bored demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. He wasn't just a deputy anymore. He was a liability being filmed by a man who knew exactly how to dismantle an empire. "Handcuff him, Rollins," Caleb commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a superior officer of the law. The sun of Asheville didn't just rise that morning. It exposed the rot. The sunlight no longer sparkled on the gold-plated SUV. It was now just a cold, silent lump of metal being winched onto a police tow truck. The sterling name, once a suit of armor, had become a lead weight. The power of a senator cannot reach into the encrypted tactical logs that Caleb had already forwarded to the Department of Justice. The Vet Thuong I key of Sterling had led him to a cage of his own making. In a sterile courtroom, a female judge with eyes as sharp as flint looked not at the Davenport bank accounts, but at the digital footprint of a predator. The 3-year sentence for aggravated assault and hate crimes wasn't just a number, it was the sound of a golden gate slamming shut. And in the quiet, dusty corner of the precinct, Rollins, the man who had made the badge a joke, was forced to take it off. He laid it on the desk with a trembling hand, the silver reflecting a world he no longer controlled. When a ghost like Caleb Vance executes justice, he doesn't just catch the criminal, he purges the system. The Blue Ridge was quieter that night, not because the threat was gone, but because the wolves had finally realized that the mountain was guarded by something much stronger than fear. The V than Gai Khan had fallen, and in their place a new, honest peace began to grow among the pines. A month later, the Blue Ridge air smells of cedar and hope, not poison. New life is pushing through the blackened soil, a sanctuary Elara hasn't yet named, born from the ashes of hate. Atlas, his ribs healed, rests his chin on her prosthetic, a silent vow of loyalty. In the garage, Caleb Vance still watches, his gray eyes now warm like the morning sun. He never asked for thanks, and she never offered words. They simply exist in a shared, honest peace. Protected by her ghost, Elara Thorne realizes that the most beautiful part of her life is only just beginning. The Blue Ridge reminds us that true power isn't meant for dominance, but for protection. Like Caleb Vance, real guardians don't need wings. They have calloused hands and a spirit forged in the fire of service. This story is a mirror for us all. Will you be a bystander to injustice, or will you find the strength to be a shepherd for those in need? If this journey of resilience touched your heart, please share it and write Amen below to join our community of faith. May God keep you and your loved ones safe. Thank you for watching.